All right, we're going to get started. Thank you for coming. My name is Megan Morris. I am the director of the Qualitative Research Core at Accord. And today we'll be talking about qualitative research and a little bit about mixed methods. So just by show of hands, who has done a qualitative research? Okay. All right. So today is going to be a really quick, broad overview of kind of what qualitative research is. In particular, the goal is for you to read today and be a bit more familiar with the language around qualitative research and maybe engage with a qualitative researcher, maybe read a qualitative research article and understand what the methods were, and then also to potentially spark your interest in perhaps additional training. So we have a lot to cover. I'm going to go pretty quickly throughout, but feel free to raise your hand and ask questions throughout. So first do an introduction to what qualitative research is, talk about some of the methodological approaches, in the method, you get a question, coding and analysis, a little bit about quality, and then finally a little bit about mixed methods. So qualitative research, most of you, if not all of you, probably did not receive any sort of training during undergrad or maybe even graduate school, but so sometimes people think that qualitative research is new, but actually it's been around for decades and has its early roots in the social sciences, particularly in anthropology and sociology. It's really just been more recently that we have taken the methods and methodologies from qualitative research and thought about how we can apply that to our area, so health services research. And so because of that, we're still, the methods and how we apply qualitative research is still evolving. So, so some of the recommendations that I'm going to make today, you'll say, but I read an article and they didn't do X, Y, and Z. Well, that's because we're all still learning of what qualitative research methods look like in our very applied setting. So first, what are our data sources? So our data sources can include interviews, documents, or texts, such as an EMR or tweets, and then observations. We say that qualitative is guided by, while it is guided by research questions, you have questions that you want to ask, and so you do a qualitative research project, you're not necessarily testing hypotheses, right? So sometimes we say this qualitative is hypothesis generating, not hypothesis testing. It is naturalistic, so it occurs in the natural environment. So we're not looking at people in a lab or a very controlled clinical lab type of environment, but we're studying people in their natural experience where they live and work every day. And it's interpretive, so that involves the researcher making sense and making sense of and representing the situation or the phenomenon of interest. So this is a figure here. So we have quantitative research here on this side, and qualitative on the other side. So quantitative is very positivism, and qualitative, you can see, is on the other side of interpretation. So can someone tell me what positivism is? And you don't have to pronounce it. Can you guess what it might be as compared to qualitative? Yes. Yeah?
Using the word publicly impose something like that.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. Okay. So over here, focuses on one truth. There is one answer. Is, to try to find your statistically significant, your p-value, your variables. You think about controlling for them, whereas in qualitative, we actually try to embrace them and describe those variables. The focus is on generalizability. So, you have a random sample and you study this one population to find out X, Y, and Z so that you can, again, you want a random sample that represents the population of interest so that you can make statements about population levels. Whereas qualitative, again, context is embraced. We describe the setting in which we are studying this phenomenon of interest. And generalizability is not really our primary interest, okay? So the strengths of qualitative is that it helps us understand meaning. So in the growth of, what? The door. Oh. So in the growth of kind of patient-reported outcomes, well, how do you create a patient-reported outcomes? You have to talk to patients. What is the outcomes that are most interesting to them? How are they perceiving their outcomes? So again, you need the meaning behind those. Understanding contexts. So how organization culture affects work routines would be an example of it. So what are the things in your environment that are leading to some positive change? So, why, let's say, hand washing. So why is there uptake of hand washing in one unit and not another unit? Understand social processes, so how interactions between people happen. So, for example, patients handoffs at shift changes. And then qualitative is very helpful in generating theories or frameworks. What qualitative research is not? It is not survey research. Can someone tell me why I might say that?
Definitely go hand in hand.
Okay. So say more about that.
I guess we're getting into mixed methods. And you might have one study where we do both.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So sometimes people say, "Oh, because there's words, it must be qualitative." But a survey is you ask an item, a question, and you have an option for it, so it's very closed. Whereas qualitative, you're hoping that the goal is to have your participants really generate the ideas. Okay. Some people say, "Oh, but I want to have some open-ended questions at the end of the survey." Again, this is typically not qualitative because you are trying. One of the goals of qualitative, again, understand the lived experience, understand the meaning people are making, and having 1 to 2 sentences is really not going to get very in-depth about that person's experience about whatever phenomenon they're studying. We often get asked about this. Hi, I put together an advisory committee or a stakeholder panel, and we had a discussion and we recorded it. So it's qualitative, right? No, not really, unfortunately. So there's different goals of having an advisory or stakeholder meeting. You're providing them information, and it's this kind of back and forth. You're trying to understand, is there feedback on some research protocol or some patient protocol you're going to implement in the clinic. Whereas qualitative, you really are there to listen and elicit their. And then finally, people say, "Oh, I talked to a few people. That's qualitative, right?" No, we do have very standardized protocols for how we elicit our interviews in our focus groups and do our observations. So what do you need to think about when beginning a qualitative study? So I'm first going to talk about reflexivity, which is the conscious self-awareness. And it's the having you think through how your assumptions and behaviors might affect the study. So one of the major critiques people say about qualitative is, isn't it subjective? Isn't it whatever the researcher wants to hear, they're going to hear? Well, I would actually argue that might be also quantitative, because sometimes in quantitative, well, how do you select the variables you're interested in? Well, you might have some attitudes, some assumptions, some baseline knowledge about your data, or what, again, you generate a hypothesis, so that must have come from somewhere. So you do have some pre-existing ideas, and you have to recognize that those pre-existing ideas are going to influence the research process. I just say in qualitative, we just name it and call it out a lot more. So we say we wear our biases and assumptions on our sleeves. And sometimes a bias or an assumption can be a good thing or a bad thing, or sometimes it's just neutral. So if you are a clinician, say a cardiologist doing research about X clinical situation in your clinic, and you're doing a study where you're interviewing patients with that particular cardiac condition, it's going to be important you know that clinical context and where they're coming from. So that clinical knowledge is actually really important versus someone who's coming at it very brand new. But you will often want to put together multidisciplinary teams, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So, but it's important to remember we think about talking through your reflexivity at the very beginning and then all the way throughout the study. So another way to put it, reflexivity examines the impact of the researcher on the participants, or researcher and participants on each other and on their research. So one of the things I hope you get out of this, qualitative is a lot of fun. I don't know if anyone who's done one has not found something very interesting, and especially if you're a clinician, it's I've had a lot of clinicians say that it really has enhanced their practice, their interactions with their patients, their parents, etc. So in that way, you need to think about being open to how the research is actually changing you as a researcher. So when you start to think about your research question, you need to think about what is your relationship with the question, the settings, and the participants, and how your answer might affect how you design this project. So again, if you are a physician, let's say I've had this come up. A attending wants to do a research study about, let's say, burnout in the ICU, and he's interested in what residents think. Well, his position as an attending in that particular ICU really might not be an appropriate power differentiation of him recruiting his own residents to participate in the study. So he might think about having someone else as a part of his research team kind of recruit those people. So again, think about your relationship with the participants, the setting, and the question. And so your position in that situation, it could limit you, but I've also had a situation where we are interviewing senior physicians across the country, and sometimes it's really best to have another physician be the one interviewing them. All right. So thinking about your research team, I sort of alluded to this a few minutes ago. Qualitative research is not a solo activity. You need to think about who you're going to include in your research team, what are their backgrounds, and how might their backgrounds influence the research process. So again, if you are a clinician, perhaps you will have someone who's not. Be a research assistant with maybe a very different background, kind of approach your data. I'm working on one study right now where we're coding some data from focus groups, and we have a bunch of psychologists involved in this kind of psychology project, and we have a research assistant with no psychology background, and she is right there working right beside these psychologists, because the psychologists see something in the data, and then they kind of, oh, well, this means X, Y, Z, da, 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 because of their pre-existing knowledge. Whereas that research assistant with no psychology background says, well, if we're just looking at the data, that's not how I'm reading it. That's not how I'm thinking that this parent might have been describing their situation. So it's really good to have this multidisciplinary team, and again, multiple team members looking at the data across all aspects of the research process, so you get this balanced look at what the participants are saying, and it helps with the interpretation. You need to think about what are the motivators and biases of the team members, and how that might affect how they're seeing the data. So qualifications of the team members. So who do you look for when you're putting together a team? I would recommend, and we recommend, considering having, especially if you're new to this and it's your very first project, is meeting with a PhD level qualitative methodologist, just like you would do with a statistics project. You would meet with a biostatistician, okay? And then your research assistants, who do you look for? We have had, there's no one actually degree in qualitative research like there is for biostats. So we often pull from different social sciences, so anthropology, sociology, but also public health and health services types of degrees. So this is a table, and you have, I won't go through all of this, but something we created at Accords for the different levels of team members, so from your PRA all the way down to your qualitative methodologist, and we've kind of broke it down with types of skills. So again, I won't go over that, but that's kind of, this is the guidelines we have created in Accords. All right. So you select your question and you have your team. So how do you get launched into this project? So this is a figure that I really like, partly because it shows what I think it's illustrating is that qualitative is not a very linear process. Sometimes when we give these presentations, we try to make it as linear as possible just for the sake of kind of conveying the information, but it is a multi-step process that can go round and round. But first, up at the very top there, we have epistemology. And I won't talk about epistemology today, but this is how do you believe that knowledge or truth gets constructed. And we actually all have epistemology. You all have epistemology. Probably didn't know that. You had epistemology you're bringing around with you. But your epistemology will really affect how you think about how you ask your questions, how you select your research participants, etc. So your epistemology is really going to affect your methodology. And I'll go through a few examples of different methodologies. And then, but this is sort of the theory or guiding practice that affects the rest of your research process. And that's going to help guide the methods that you select. So interviews, focus groups, reviewing documents, and then that's your methods, and then you analyze your data, and then that helps generate knowledge. All right, so first to start off with methodology. So your methodology informs the entire research process. It informs question development, data collection, analysis, and it is a guiding framework throughout the process. Again, this is one I'll say, have multiple people say, but I read a qualitative published article and they didn't state what their methodology is. Well, more and more journals and reviewers are asking for a methodology, so I think it's just great to start with one because it doesn't take any extra time or money to think through what your methodology is. And I think for the most part, it's very useful in thinking through as you go throughout the research project. Just a point of clarification, methodology versus methods. So methodology is your theoretical epistemological approach versus your methods are your tools for data collection. Your methodological approach is different from a conceptual framework. So a conceptual framework might be like the health belief model or a behavior change framework or model that helps guide really the content of the question you're asking. And this is, your methodological approach is really going to guide the methods that you're using. So there's multiple different types of methodological approaches from many different disciplines, anthropology, sociology, philosophy, etc. Here are some of the very common ones that you'll see is grounded theory. People heard of grounded theory? Yeah. I say that people like grounded theory the most because it has the word theory in it, and that makes sense to people, versus phenomenology that you have to practice learning how to say. But those are two really common methodological approaches. Content analysis is another, discourse analysis, ethnography and case study, and then thematic analysis is something else you'll see. We're not going to go through all of these. I just wanted to today just give you a flavor of a few of them. So first, one of the questions I often get, well, how do you decide which methodological approach to choose? Consider the question you're asking and really match the question with your methodological approach. And then think it through. So each methodology has a different intent on what your outcome will be. So for example, and I'll get into this grounded theory, your end product is going to be a theory or model. Whereas phenomenology, you're going to have thick descriptions and themes as your outcomes. So think about what outcomes do you want from your study and who is your audience. There's no wrong or right methodological orientation. You just need to pick one and stick with it throughout the project, okay? And some people say, oh, but I like a little bit from here and a little bit from here. And the other thing to remember is that many of the approaches and analysis processes are very similar across the different methodological approaches, so don't really get hung up on, oh, but I like this over here, this. Choose one and stick with it throughout the process. All right, so grounded theory is the aim, as I said, is to develop or discover a theory or framework about a phenomenon of interest. So that it's very useful for developing a theory that you can then go and test in future quantitative work. There are some key features for the sampling and coding processes, most notably constant comparison analysis and theoretical sampling. So again, each of these methodological orientations developed from different disciplines, so they all have a little bit of their own vocabulary. So your end product is the model, theory, or framework, and then thinking about who your audience and how a grounded theory project could be important to your audience. For clinicians and policymakers, it is useful in helping them understand the factors that contribute to a particular phenomenon. For researchers, it can, again, develop a theory that can then be used to test or build future interventions. Example questions that are framed from a grounded theory perspective are: how do teams make decisions on the timing of intubation of septic patients? And then from the perspective of emergency general surgery teams, what are the factors that influence the higher rate of mortality in EGS as compared to general surgery? Any questions about that? Yes?
Just a more general question specifically about that, but as a Catholic, if we want to use this methodology, would we need to know which theory, and is there a book or resource, or is this why we would include someone like yourself at the PhD level to help us?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could take a class and do lots of reading and figure it out, just like you could get a statistical textbook and figure it out. But it's, yeah, I would recommend consulting with a methodologist and helping you kind of think through. But we do have some resources. I'll just give a plug. Julie Barnard will be speaking next week, kind of the second half of this, and we'll be providing some.
Next week.
Yes. Some resources and common textbooks and articles. But all right, phenomenology. So the aim of phenomenology is to understand the lived experience of a particular phenomenon. So it's very useful in this setting is to think through if you're trying to understand patients or providers or caregivers' experiences of going through X, situations. So for patients going through X type of disease process, for clinicians going through X type of having X type of job. It's very much geared towards past or current experiences. It's not particularly useful in predicting future experiences. So your end product is going to be these descriptive themes that describe the essence of the lived experience. And how can this be applied to our audiences? It's helpful in understanding the lived or day-to-day experiences. So coming up with maybe a patient-reported outcome, it might be really important to understand the symptoms they have of X disease or condition, and again, their experience living with that. Researchers helps generate research questions that are based on the experiences of the target population. Example research questions. So for patients with speech disabilities, what are their lived experiences obtaining primary care services? What is the lived experience of living with a PEG tube? Could be another one. Okay. Any questions about those? Yeah.
Can you use this methodology for having the parents about child experience, or is it really direct?
Yes, it depends on, again, your question and your yes. But it will get to the parents' perceptions of their children. So, yeah. So for example, that first question was part of my dissertation. The patients would always talk about their perceptions of what they thought the physicians thought about them. So, and sometimes that's important to think through, and that actually might be an important piece of data to understand how they think others are perceiving them. Okay. Sometimes people think, thick descriptions, how useful is that? I would say I've written off of that one question and the data I got from that. I wrote 3 papers, and I have 4 grant applications that came out of that. So thick descriptions can be very useful. All right, we're going to launch now into our methods and data collection. So common methods that we use: interviews, which can be in person, or we also do frequently on the phone. Focus groups, which can also be in person, or we've also done online. Observations, and then also document review.
What is an online focus group?
So there's 2 types. There's synchronous and asynchronous. So synchronous is everyone signs into Zoom at a predefined time, and we all talk about whatever topic you're interested, the goal of the project. Asynchronous is a discussion board. So you have it open for, let's say, a week, and you post questions every few days, and people sign on and respond. So, yeah. So generally, these methods can align with any of the methodologies, except for some exceptions with the focus group. So, yeah. Another major question I typically get asked is, how do I determine my sample size? So how do I determine how many people I interview, or how many focus groups I do? And this is very ambiguous. And the answer is always going to be, it depends. And so, or another way to say it's it's as many as it is necessary to learn what you need to know. So we talk about getting thematic saturation. Okay. So you want to focus on quality, though, not quantity of participants. So if you have too few of interviews, then you're not really going to get a very clear picture of the range of experiences with whatever phenomenon you're interested in. But if you have too many interviews or too many focus groups, you'll have a paralyzing amount of data. And in grant applications, and your IOB, you always have to state what your anticipated sample size is, but in reality, that you're not really going to know until you get into the data and you start collecting the data and seeing kind of what's emerging and kind of what are the themes or the stories that are coming up, and are there consistencies you're seeing across participants. You might also need to think about subgroups. So let's say you are doing a study about implementing a new intervention to decrease overuse of antibiotics in the ICU and EED. Well, you might want to think about, again, those are two different settings, so you have two different subgroups there, but you might want to think of physicians, so attending, residents, and then your advanced practice clinicians. So again, you can start to get into the different subgroups and could sometimes easily blow up your projects. So as an aside to kind of give you an estimate, because you're like, well, I'll just interview everyone and it will be great and we'll just generate all this data. It can be a lot of work though. So approximately our estimate is about 1 hour of interview is about 15 research hours for planning, scheduling, conducting, transcribing, and analyzing. Okay. So it can quickly add up when you start to add in lots of subgroups, lots of participants. So this is an example of a study done at Accord. So the research question was, why do adolescent females of Hispanic origin have lower immunization rates against HPV? And so they thought about stratifying the sample population based off of parents of adolescents who have not started the series, parents of adolescents who have not reached the second or third shot, and then also providers at public and private clinics. And let's say if we're going to, for this study, we were doing focus groups, so you're going to need between 2 to 3 focus groups as a minimum for each of your populations, with 10 to 12 participants per focus group. Okay? Or another way to think about it, if you're doing interviews instead, 10 to 12 interviews per kind of, again, subgroup. All right. There is some data, some researchers in the literature say that you can reach kind of theoretical saturation with as little as like 6 to 7 people. If you interview 6 to 7 people, you're going to have a hard time getting that published. So I'd say think about, I like to say kind of a minimum of 20 for publication's sake. So again, saturation, it's additional data. So additional data is not going to reveal any new information. So it's this gut check of the person who's doing the interviews, and they say, oh, can't do another interview because I know exactly what they're going to say, and you can predict what the next research participant's going to say. And that's when you know you have reached saturation. All right. Very quickly onto coding and analysis. We're just flying through this. So coding is the process of organizing your written material. So you do an interview, you get it transcribed, and you're going to try to break this up into chunks or segment of text to process and make sense of. All right. Coding is not the analysis, but it's a part of the analysis process, and it's a tool. Okay. You can code your transcripts from your interviews or focus groups, visual data, so you can actually code pictures, field notes, which are notes you take after doing, let's say, an observation or doing an interview. You'll take notes on what you observed. That's field notes. So observation notes are for actually going out and doing, let's say, a practice observation. writing out what you're seeing, and then any written material. So again, EMR fields, policies, different posts on Facebook, things like that. All right, so this is an example. We won't get too into exactly how you create your codes, but so this is a code nickname. This is the full name. So, and then this is a definition of the code and then an example. So, and you can have subcodes as well. There are two types of coding processes. There is inductive and there's also deductive coding. So inductive is sometimes called open coding. And really the difference between this is inductive is your codes are derived from the texts themselves, whereas deductive is you basically create your list of your codes and then go in and apply them to your text. So very quickly to go through the open coding process. So you're going to have two or more coders independently, and this is just one way to do it. There's different ways people do this, but again, just for the process of being a little bit linear today, I will talk about one way to do it. So you're going to have two or more coders independently review 1 to 3 of the transcripts to develop a code book. So you'll read it and say, okay, this is what I'm hearing here. This is what I'm hearing here. And what you're hearing and what you describe, that's the code you're applying to that coded piece of text. So two people do that for a few transcripts on their own, and then they meet to discuss and say, hey, when I heard this, this is how I talked about it. This is the type of code I created for that. Someone's like, oh, I had something similar, or I had something different. And then you talk through and you reconcile and you come up with a kind of agreed upon list of codes and their definitions. Sometimes, again, that's one process, or another process, let's say you have a larger team and members are very familiar with the data. Maybe they've been doing all the interviews and they've been reviewing the interview transcripts. You might come up with some codes based off, again, just the familiarity with the data. And then you have that as your codes and your definitions, and then you go through your transcripts and kind of start applying that and making sure that it still works. Okay, so once you have that initial code book that you created, then you're going to go to a next few transcripts and apply that code book to those transcripts and see how it works. So you might need to create additional codes because something came out in that transcript that didn't come out in the last few. Maybe you realize, oh, these two codes are kind of similar together. You might want to merge your codes, or maybe you realize, oh, I need some more subcodes, or maybe this definition doesn't really make sense to me. So you again apply that initial, and then you meet together again, and you review it and say, what did you think about this? This is what I was struggling with. This is what I added. This is what I deleted. And then again, you reconcile. The process called reconciling through consensus to really create a modified code book. And you keep going through that process until you have your final code book. And I would say it depends on the data, but between like 25 and 1/3 of the data, it should be after that kind of point that you have a pretty solid code book. Yeah.
So to develop your code book, when you go into looking at subsequent transcripts and find out new magic codes, do you have to go back and re-code the previous transcripts?
Sometimes you do. Yeah. I mean, maybe you created a new code because it just didn't come up, but maybe it's because, oh, we are just thinking about this in a different way, so, or kind of our thinking has progressed, so therefore we needed to actually go back to those original ones and recode them. So, again, not very linear. All right. So once you have your final code book, you need to then apply that code book to your remaining transcripts. You can double code all of them, a portion, or none of them. And it really just depends on the size of your team, the type of project and the type of data, how complex or nuanced the data are really going to affect kind of which one you select. So, but no matter what, you should meet regularly to, if you're doing double coding, reconciling the discrepancies. You're not going to do inter-rater reliability scores, which we can talk about later if you are interested in why we don't do that. But you also might, if you're not double coding, have ideas or questions that arose while you're coding, so you bring those to the group, discuss them. Maybe there's a passage that you found particularly challenging or interesting and you want to share it with the group and talk through that. And then also to avoid code drifting, definition drifting, so making sure that everyone is really still on the same page of what that code means and what its definition is. So like I said, deductive is start with more of a predetermined set of codes and apply that to your transcripts, and this is often determined your codes by existing literature. We would say it's relatively rare. The vast majority use qualitative research use inductive methods, but I also say that what's less rare is to use a mix of kind of deductive and inductive codes. Okay, so this is just an example. This is hand coding of, here's the transcripts, and this is training satisfaction. And so that's the code we applied to that section. Patient comments, ergonomics. So, and you can see up here, we actually double coded it, actually triple. There's some part is about ergonomics, a larger part is about features, and this is special populations. So, yeah. Yeah, so so what's going to happen, let me get to that in a few minutes. So, okay. So there are different software programs that help you code and manage the data. They do not analyze your data for you, okay? Your analysis machine is your brain, you can't just stick your transcripts into Atlas or NVivo and then have it dump out your analysis for you. But it is very helpful in, again, organizing your data, particularly if you're working team-based. Okay. So actually, let me go back to your question about, so what you're going to do is, so you put into NVivo and Atlas. We're mostly an Atlas campus, but if you want to use NVivo, that's great too. They're very similar. So you're going to put all your coded data, it's all going to be in your software program. And then you're going to say, you'll start to run queries or reports to say, okay, Atlas, every time someone talked about special populations, I want to see all those quotations together. And so then you type that in, and then Atlas spits out across, let's say, your 20 interviews, all the quotations, every time you coded special populations across all of your transcripts. And so that's very useful to see, and a critical tool in the analysis process to look about about concepts across your different participants. So what that means, though, for coding, whether you code a little bit or a lot more, is that when that report gets spit back out to you, you're not going to have that context. So you're going to need to code enough of that sentence or enough of that paragraph to have it make sense if it stood on its own. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So you're going to, again, pull these reports and try to look for patterns across all of your transcripts, all of your participants. Okay? And this figure here is to demonstrate that your codes don't necessarily map directly, not like codes 1 through 5 go to this theme, and 6 through 10 go to this theme, that your codes can actually fit in across your themes. So this process can make your hair grow gray a little bit, but because again, you have to really be very familiar, be very engaged with your data to start to look at themes across your participants. Okay. So this is a diagram to demonstrate that this is not a linear process. So you start with your wealth of data, and then you immerse yourself in it. You think about some ideas. You start to run these queries kind of to see, okay, is this showing up? And then you then go to the literature, say, okay, what's the literature saying about this? You go back, you need to do an internal recheck, and then go back and look for patterns. And then ultimately, I mean, you could go through these processes multiple times, but ultimately you will get at the end themes and subthemes. And this process probably seems very abstract at this point, but this is what, we teach whole classes on this process. So a 5-minute instruction or demonstration is not, you shouldn't know how to do this from this slide. So really quick, want to show, this is the COREC. So equator network, so if you're familiar with reporting guidelines, so for consort, for RCTs, COREC is the main checklist for reporting of qualitative research methods. So it has 32 items. The author of this is Allison Tong. So I am seeing more and more journals actually use this or require the authors to talk about the items in this checklist. So this is actually, we recommend starting, when you start your project, starting with this checklist to see, kind of making sure you do all these items or most of these items, because you might be asked about it. But, okay. That was a whirlwind of qualitative. Any questions before we do even more of a whirlwind of mixed methods? All right. So mixed methods research design. So oftentimes the questions we're asking cannot be answered solely with qualitative and solely with quantitative. And you might want to do both qualitative and quantitative. And the key component that I would like you to walk away with and understand from what mixed methods is that it requires a mixing of your qualitative and your quantitative, okay? It is not simply, we collected some quant data over here and we collected a qual data here, we'll just put them in the same paper, done. You actually have to have some level of mixing of the data. So you can say, not to say if you collected a survey and did some interviews and you published those together, that's could be totally fine and totally appropriate for your research question, your research projects. That's just a multiple methods study, okay? So there's different types of mixings of the data for mixing of the qualitative and quantitative. So there's merging. So this happens when the quantitative and qualitative data are integrated at the analysis and comparison stage. So you've collected your qualitative, collected your quantitative, and then you kind of merge them in the analysis. There's connecting, where one form of data informs the collection or sampling of another. So you might do some qualitative interviews to collect kind of baseline information about a phenomenon of interest, and then use the results of that to create inform a quantitative survey, okay? Or maybe you did a randomized control trial and you have some really nice quant data, but this one subpopulation just did not do well in our trial. How do we make sense of this? Well, you might need to go back and do some qualitative interviews with those study participants to see why did this not really work with this one population. All right, and then lastly, there's embedding. So this is maybe, again, you do a larger study, let's say a larger RCT that's, again, very quantitative, and then you embed some qualitative components and studies, kind of questions throughout it. And it's, again, embedded within the larger project. NIH actually offers guidelines for how to do mixed methods. It's on the NIH's Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research. It's pretty easy to Google and find. All right. I left 5 minutes for questions. So, qualitative research, I hope you realize it's a science. It's not just, again, talking to a few people and like writing some things down or summaries of what they said. It does require training and experience. We have many years of doing this, and we have degrees to do this. Qualitative is cheaper than doing, let's say, an RCT or some other methods, but it still does cost money. It costs money to hire the people to do the interviews and focus groups. It costs money to get things transcribed. You oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes have to pay participants. That costs money. So it adds up. So it's not insignificant. And then hopefully I've piqued your interest.